This video is sponsored by Delete Me. June 4th, 1942. It's the height of the Pacific War, and Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stands on Akagi's bridge. Below him stretches the pride of Japan's Navy, 4 aircraft carriers that struck Pearl Harbor just months earlier, now slicing through open water toward Midway Atoll. The plan is simple: crush the island's defenses, then lure out and destroy what's left of America's carriers. So far, everything is going according to plan. For over 2 hours, wave after wave of American aircraft hurl themselves at the fleet. Brave, but hopeless against the enemy fighters. Back on Akagi's flight deck, ground crews scramble to arm the next strike. Victory feels close. Above, Zero fighters twist through the clouds, shredding every formation of American torpedo planes. On Akagi's deck, crews rush to load the next strike. Just as the last torpedo bombers limp away over the waves, high above the formation, breaking out of the blinding sun, dozens of aircraft with screaming engines fall from the sky in near vertical dives. The Japanese carriers are wide open. Their decks are packed with fueled and armed planes. Zero scramble for altitude after chasing the torpedo planes to sea level. They're too late. American dive bombers lock onto their targets, and at 1,500 feet, the bay doors finally swing open. The slow but deadlies have arrived. At Midway, the Japanese fleet learned firsthand how dangerous exposure could be. In moments, their vital information, carrier locations, and strike preparations became fatal vulnerabilities, exploited by American dauntless dive bombers. Today, your personal data is similarly exposed. Data brokers operate quietly in the background, secretly collecting and selling your personal information. Your home address, phone number, employment details, and even photos, exposing you to risks such as identity theft, targeted phishing scams, and unwanted online harassment. That's why we at Dark Skies personally recommend Delete Me. Our sponsor, Delete Me, isn't just a reactive measure. It's a proactive online privacy service that continuously scans hundreds of data broker sites, ensuring your personal details stay out of the wrong hands. When we first set up our accounts, Delete Me provided a detailed privacy report within just a week, clearly showing each site holding our personal information and confirming when their privacy experts successfully removed it. Delete Me also stands apart by offering custom removal requests, addressing your specific privacy concerns personally. Their transparent reporting and regular updates mean you'll always know exactly how your data is protected. And because data brokers also expose your family members' details, Delete Me's family plans ensure comprehensive protection for everyone you care about. Don't wait for your privacy to be compromised. Take immediate control by visiting joindeleteme.com/darkskies and use promo code DARKSKIES to get 20% off your subscription. Protect yourself and your family. Because, like the surprise dive bombers at Midway, data breaches strike when least expected. Meet the Dauntless. In the late 1930s, Douglas Aircraft acquired the smaller Northrop Aviation. Among the company's many unfinished projects was the XBT-2, a dive bomber prototype in dire need of refinement. Over the next 2 years, Douglas engineers worked around the clock on redesigning the model, improving stability, power, and handling. And in April 1939, the United States Navy placed an order for 144 aircraft. The story of the Scout Bomber Douglas, or SBD Dauntless, took off. A 2-seat carrier-based dive bomber, the Dauntless was driven by a 1,000-horsepower Wright R1820-60 radial engine, which gave it a maximum speed of 255 miles per hour and a range of up to 1,100 miles. Though easily recognized by its rounded wings and greenhouse-style canopy, the aircraft's most distinctive feature was undoubtedly its perforated dive flaps. Deployed above and below the wings during steep dives, these unique flaps provided exceptional stability and accuracy during bombing runs. For this primary mission, the SBD carried up to 1,000 pounds of bombs mounted beneath the wings and fuselage. At the time, even before its first mission, many within the service dismissed the Dauntless as obsolete, too slow, and inadequately armed for modern combat, a mere stopgap until something better came along. However, the lucky crew members who actually got to fly the Dauntless would discover an entirely different aircraft, captured perfectly in the nickname they gave it: slow but deadly. The United States Marine Corps was the first branch to receive the first batch of SBD-1s in 1940, followed by the Navy's improved SBD-2. By March 1941, The third model, the SBD-3, arrived with more fuel, self-sealing tanks, and added armor. As the Navy rushed to upgrade, on December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, plunging America and the SBD Dauntless into war. Outmatched at Pearl Harbor. That very morning, a group of scouting aircraft, including 18 SBDs, based at the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, were returning to Hawaii from Wake Island when they ran into outright devastation. As far as their eyes could see, there were battleships listing, shattered hangars, and Japanese fighters and bombers streaking through the chaos. For a moment, the shell-shocked men could only stare. Then the realization hit. Pearl Harbor, the heart of the Pacific Fleet, was in flames. And now, they were heading straight into an ambush. As a large and buzzing swarm of A6M0 fighters dove right into the Dauntless formation, their machine guns rattling loudly, everyone on board the American aircraft reacted instantly. Pilots shoved throttles forward, simultaneously ready to aim their two AN-M2 50 caliber machine guns. Behind them, the radio operator and tail gunner defended the aircraft from the rear with a swivel-mounted AMN-2 30 caliber machine gun. However, the models were simply out of their element against the nimble enemy fighters. They were designed for precise strikes on warships, not air-to-air fights. Within minutes of the encounter, 7 American SBDs were at the bottom of the ocean. Only a few miles away at Iwo Field, Marine Air Group 21's models, a mix of SBD Dauntless dive bombers, F-4F Wildcat fighters, and utility aircraft, didn't even get a chance to fight back as the Japanese bombers swept through the models parked out in the open, sending explosions rippling across the airfield, destroying nearly every single one of the almost 50 aircraft. Within hours, the attack on Pearl Harbor ended, leaving the Americans battered. But before long, the Dauntless would fight back. This is for my men. On December 10th, Lieutenant Howard S. Sam Dickinson patrolled off the coast of Hawaii in his SBD, still entirely haunted by the memories of 3 days before. Having witnessed Pearl Harbor's devastation firsthand, the images refused to fade from his mind. Burning battleships, thick black smoke, and the cries of men, some of them his dear friends, caught in the melee with no way out. As he skimmed his Dauntless low over the Pacific Ocean, the pilot's horrible thoughts were suddenly interrupted when he spotted a long, dark shape cutting through the waves. It was an Imperial Japanese submarine, and the perfect chance to avenge his fallen squadron mates. Unbeknownst to him, this vessel was none other than I-70, one of the submarines that guided the attack on Pearl Harbor. For days, she and her men had slipped through the ocean unseen. But that morning, she was caught in the open by someone who had nothing to lose. Dickinson tightened his grip on the control stick, launching the Dauntless into a steep dive. Tropical wind whipped past the greenhouse canopy as the altimeter spun uncontrollably. Looking through the periscope, the Japanese spotted the incoming American aircraft and, desperate to escape, veered the vessel. It was too little, too late. As he peered through the bomb sight, Dickinson locked onto the target and released a bomb. Mere seconds later, the ocean erupted, sending a massive geyser of salt water and torn steel skyward. After barely clearing the powerful shockwave, the pilot banked hard. Leaving the scene of the crime, he looked over his shoulder, and he and his navigator saw the ocean swallow the first Japanese warship lost to American air power. With this, I-70 was no more. All that remained was a widening slick of oil, debris, and the sweet smell of vengeance. Battle of the Coral Sea. By early 1942, as the American war effort ramped up, the SBD Dauntless had become the backbone of Navy and Marine aviation. During the year's first quarter, carriers Enterprise, Lexington, and Yorktown launched a series of fast-hitting raids on Japanese outposts across the Pacific. From the Marshall Islands to Lae and Salamaua, Dauntless crews bombed shore installations, struck enemy shipping, and scouted ahead of the fleet. On April 18th, as Lieutenant Colonel James H. Jimmy Doolittle finalized plans for his daring raid on Tokyo, a Dauntless crew patrolling ahead of USS Hornet spotted a Japanese picket boat floating 650 miles off Japan's coast. Realizing the enemy had seen them, the crew quickly radioed it in. Minutes later, orders arrived. Doolittle's B-25 bombers had to launch immediately. As the fleet turned away at full speed for the first American attack on mainland Japan, Dauntless crews continued to scan the seas, watching for any sign of a Japanese response. By May, the Empire had its sights set on Port Moresby, a gateway to Australia that would help Japan secure the South Pacific. To stop this advance, the United States Navy sent the mighty Task Force 17, led by the carriers USS Lexington and USS Yorktown. Warplanes tore through the skies for 4 days as the Battle of the Coral Sea raged on. While ships certainly hunted each other, in the end, the aircraft would decide the fate of this significant battle. On the 7th, the Imperial Japanese light carrier Shoho steamed through the Pacific, as she and her more than 800 crew members worked shielding the invasion force bound for Port Moresby when American scout planes spotted her, triggering an immediate and massive assault. Fighters and torpedo bombers were the first to strike, forcing Shoho's escorts into a desperate defense. Just as chaos grew throughout the carrier, dozens of SPDs, armed with their 1,000-pound bombs, swept into position, ready to deliver the final blow. Shoho spotted. Among the Dauntless crews was Lieutenant Stanley Swede Vedasa and his temporary rear gunner, Walter Schindler, who was filming the day's ordeal from the back seat. For a moment, the duo watched the Japanese carrier as she began to catch fire from earlier hits, the crew scrambling as they tried to contain the damage. But now, it was their time to strike. Vedasa grabbed the stick and pushed forward, sending his Dauntless into a near-vertical nosedive. When he finally locked the target, he looked through the bomb sight, released the massive payload, and watched as it tumbled toward the carrier below. As the 1,000-pound bomb tumbled free and into the middle of the ship, a large explosion ripped through the deck, sending steel and fire rocketing skyward. Shoho continued to convulse violently as wave after wave of Dauntlesses also dropped their payloads nearly simultaneously, hammering the carrier from bow to stern and everything in between. Shoho's engine sputtered to a stop as she lurched onto her side, the list growing steeper by the second. Smoke poured from her battered hull, while salt water rushed in full force. As the Pacific swallowed her forever, Lieutenant Commander Robert E. Dixon, leading Yorktown's dive bombers, called it in with a now iconic line, quote, "Scratch one flat top." Shoho was the first Japanese carrier lost in the war, and the Dauntless had sealed her fate. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, the SBD Dauntless had more than proven itself at steep dives, the very job it was built to do. But even more than that, it also proved that, in the hands of skilled naval aviators, the aircraft was also good at air-to-air combat. An unexpected surprise. The morning after Shoho sank, on May 8th, Lieutenant Swede Vedasa was back in the air and happier than ever, flying as part of a team flying anti-torpedo plane patrol to protect USS Yorktown from enemy torpedo bombers. Shortly after 11 a.m., he and his group were suddenly under attack by a formation of Zeros from the carrier Zuikaku. With their superior speed and agility, the nimble Japanese fighters brought down 4 of the SBD dive bombers, one after the other. Right after surviving the first attack, in a steady and firm voice, Vedasa yelled to his radio operator and gunner, quote, "Son, we're in for a scrap. Keep your head and conserve your ammunition. I'll take care of the rest." Knowing the fight was far from over and that his Dauntless was next in the Japanese pilot's crosshairs, Vedasa threw his aircraft into maneuvers that tested the limits of his dive bomber. For 25 minutes, wave after wave of Zero fighters streaked in, guns blazing. Yet each time, rather than fleeing, Vedasa aggressively turned into their attacks, spoiling their aim and forcing them to overshoot. In those brief windows, he seized the opportunity and squeezed the trigger of his twin machine guns, while his rear gunner unleashed his own burst from behind, both men working in perfect unison. As the fierce duel stretched on, one of the Zeros drifted momentarily into Vedasa's sights. Taking this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, he lined up the enemy fighter and sent rounds tearing through the Zero's fuselage, sending it spiraling toward the ocean below. Against all odds, a Dauntless had just bested a Zero, considered the most remarkable fighter aircraft at the time. Though the SBD was not designed for this kind of encounter, Pilot Vedasa would not be the only one. Throughout the conflict, its crews would claim 138 air-to-air victories. That same day, the Battle of the Coral Sea ended. Though Japan had sunk USS Lexington, America had won the bigger prize. Port Moresby was safe, and for the first time in months, Japan's seemingly unstoppable advance was finally shattered, in part thanks to the SBD Dauntless. But less than a month later, the Japanese turned their attention north to a tiny atoll in the Pacific called Midway. Not on my watch. As dawn broke on June 4th, 1942, the Japanese, believing they had the element of surprise, moved to seize Midway Atoll with a massive force of more than 200 aircraft and 4 of their most powerful carriers, Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers of all sizes. Their goal was to crush the area's defenses and lure the United States Pacific Fleet into a vicious trap that would ensure their dominance in the Pacific once and for all. But what the Empire didn't know at the time was that thanks to intercepted communications, the Americans were already waiting for them. As the sun began to rise, 3 of Admiral Chester Nimitz's own carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, were northeast of Midway, well hidden beyond the horizon and ready to fight. Additionally, between the carrier squadrons and Midway's land-based aircraft, America had over 350 planes ready to meet the enemy, including more than 100 SBDs. Among those preparing to strike were the men of Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241, launching directly from Midway's eastern island and led by their respected commander, 39-year-old Major Lofton L. Henderson, who, flying at the front of the squadron, guided the VSMB 241 off from the atoll at 6:10 a.m., engines thundering as they climbed into the morning sky and right toward the Japanese carrier force. By 7:55 a.m., the Marines had visual contact, and with the Japanese fleet in sight, so were the enemy fighters. Diving fast out of the morning sun, A6M0s, one after the other, tore into the formation, their powerful machine guns blazing. With no fighter cover and no way out, only a sky full of enemy ammunition, the Marines were on their own. Undeterred, Major Henderson held steady, cleverly weaving his Dauntless through the shells sent from above. Just then, the rounds found him, ripping through the fuselage and igniting the SBD in an instant. Still, despite the flames, Henderson held formation. Witnesses would later say he never wavered. Only when the fire consumed everything did his SBD finally roll over, spiraling into the sea below. Major Henderson's men pressed on, and through a storm of gunfire, BMSB 241 continued the attack, diving on the Japanese carriers with everything they had. The dynamic duo. Somewhere in the chaos above the carriers was First Lieutenant Daniel Iverson, pushing his Dauntless into a steep dive as he tried to outrun 2 Japanese Zeros latched onto his tail. Behind him was Private First Class Wallace J. Reed, who gripped his rear gun and braced for the attack. None had time to mourn the loss of their leader when the enemy fighters closed in fast. With the aircraft falling almost vertically toward the carrier below, Reed fired burst after burst, his gun rattling in the tight confines of the rear cockpit and making his fingers hurt from the pressure as he tried to keep the Zeros at bay. Despite the smoke, flak, and confusion, Iverson steadied his dive, and at just 300 feet above the water, he released a 500-pound bomb, watching it drop cleanly toward Hiryu's flight deck. Being so close to the enemy, the duo knew there was no time to see the result, and the pilot leveled out low over the ocean, slammed the throttle forward, and pushed the engine hard, all while Reed continued to fire. As an additional 2 more Zeros joined the chase, bullets began to chew through the aircraft, hitting right in the stabilizer, rudder, wings, and even the instrument panel, sending shrapnel and glass into both men. Through it all, the SBD stayed in the fight, and Iverson held it together long enough to escape the Zeros. Wounded and flying blind, he turned the battered aircraft toward Midway and crash-landed on the island. It wasn't until he shut down the engine and the duo got out of the cockpit that they saw their Dauntless was riddled with more than 250 bullet holes. The VMSB 241 paid a heavy price for their brave attack on the carrier Hiryu, as 8 of the 16 SBD Dauntlesses were lost to enemy action. For his part, Reed received the Distinguished Flying Cross, while First Lieutenant Iverson and Major Henderson both received the Navy Cross. As the few surviving Marine Dauntlesses pulled away, Other squadrons took up the fight. Navy Avengers, Army B-26 Marauders, high-flying B-17s, and Marine SB-2U-3 Vindicators. For nearly 20 minutes, Japanese carriers came under relentless fire, their gunners scrambling between targets as wave after wave of bombers pressed the attack, giving them no time to regroup. Unbeknownst to them, before the smoke even cleared, another wave was already closing in. The turning point in the Pacific. By 9:20 a.m., 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from USS Hornet closed in on Soryu. But without fighter cover, all were torn apart before they could land a hit. More Devastators from Enterprise and Yorktown followed, this time aiming for Hiryu, but the result was the same. They were picked off one by one, their torpedoes vanishing into the sea, untouched and utterly destroyed. Though this trio of attacks failed, they surely cost the Japanese. By then, their combat air patrol and gunners had been in constant action for more than 2 hours, chasing down wave after wave of American aircraft. Ammunition was running low, fuel reserves were draining, and despite being afloat, the strain on the carriers was finally beginning to show. At 10:22 a.m., just as the last of Yorktown's torpedo bombers tried to escape at wave-top level, Japanese lookouts aboard Akagi spotted something else. High above the formation and straight out of the sun were no less than 48 SBD Dauntlesses diving toward the heart of the Japanese carrier fleet. 25 of them went after Kaga, and within seconds, 4 1,000-pound bombs destroyed her flight deck. For their part, another 6 Dauntlesses, also from the carrier USS Enterprise, headed toward Akagi, scoring 2 direct hits of their own. Simultaneously, 17 SBDs from Yorktown dove on Soryu, landing an additional 3 hits in less than 5 minutes. Before the already battered Japanese even knew what hit them, 3 of the Empire's frontline fleet carriers were on fire from bow to stern, all burning in the open ocean. That afternoon, the Dauntlesses struck again when 13 aircraft found Hiryu, the last remaining Japanese carrier, and scored 4 direct hits. Just like the others, she was set ablaze and left sinking. As the night fell, all 4 carriers, the same ones that pulverized Pearl Harbor with no mercy all those months before, were on the bottom of the ocean, all thanks to the dive bombers. This massive loss forced Admiral Yamamoto to call off the operation and order a full withdrawal. But as the defeated Japanese attempted to retreat west, U.S. pilots hunted down the remaining warships, this time aiming for cruisers Mikuma and Mogami. On June 5th, Marine Dauntlesses struck first, landing only near misses. The next morning, nearly 100 SBDs from Hornet and Enterprise found their mark, hitting Mogami twice before she barely escaped. As for Mikuma, 3 bombs ripped her hull, turning the cruiser into a smoldering wreck before she, just like the others, slipped beneath the Pacific. The cost to Japan at Midway was staggering. Over 3,000 men, 248 aircraft, and 5 warships were lost. From this moment forward, Japan was on the defensive in a war it would never win. Right at the heart of this downfall was the Douglas SBD Dauntless, the dive bomber that turned the tide of the Pacific War. Cemented status. The Battle of Midway cemented the status of the now iconic Dauntless, and for the remainder of the year, the aircraft flew battle after battle. In the brutal and months-long Guadalcanal campaign, Dauntlesses launched relentless strikes from both carriers and makeshift island airstrips, hammering Japanese ships and ground positions. That same August, squadrons from USS Enterprise and Saratoga fought fiercely at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, helping repel enemy reinforcements bound for Guadalcanal. 2 months later, during the Battle of Santa Cruz, Dauntless crews faced desperate fights to preserve America's dwindling carrier force. In November, as fighting raged in the Solomon Islands, on the other side of the world, a group of SBDs flying from USS Ranger spearheaded Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa. On the 10th, 9 Dauntlesses plunged from the skies over Casablanca, striking the French battleship Jean Bart. Just 3 days earlier, halfway across the world, their Pacific counterparts sent the Japanese battleship Hiei beneath the waves. With this, the aircraft claimed 2 battleships downed in a single week. The model was not just a Navy and Marine plane, as the United States Army Air Forces operated their own version. Named the A-24 Banshee, this model was nearly identical to the SBD-3, but without a tailhook. This aircraft initially saw action in Australia and the Dutch East Indies, but when its brief service proved disappointing, the Air Forces retired it by the end of 1942. Meanwhile, the Navy's Dauntless continued to fight all over the world, even as the newer and more powerful SB-2C Helldiver dive bomber arrived in 1943. Douglas then produced the definitive SBD-5, boasting a stronger engine, increased firepower, and a new illuminated bomb sight. In October, far from their usual Pacific hunting grounds, Dauntless crews aboard the USS Ranger plunged through icy Arctic skies toward Norway's harbor of Bodø. In Operation Leader, a bold gamble from the Americans to disrupt German supply lines, dive bombers roared low above frigid waters, weaving through fierce anti-aircraft fire as they closed in on enemy shipping. One by one, the SBDs dropped their payloads with their now famous accuracy, igniting fuel depots and tearing through the hulls of anchored freighters. The end of the road. In February 1944, the Dauntless was back in familiar waters, playing an important role in Operation Hailstone, the raid on the key Japanese naval stronghold at Truk Lagoon, destroying the island's once impenetrable defenses under the weight of endless dive-bombing attacks. By then, however, the SB-2C Helldiver was finally taking over the missions of the SBDs. The type's final major carrier operation occurred on June 20th, 1944, when SBDs took off from USS Enterprise, and the new Lexington carriers launched a strike during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. A month later, Dauntlesses provided air support for troops landing on Guam, marking the end of their time aboard carriers, despite the introduction of the SBD-6, the most powerful and advanced variant, which never saw combat. The SBD-5, however, continued to fight until the war's final days. In January 1945, Marine Dauntlesses supported American troops storming ashore at Lingayen Gulf in the Philippines. Among them was Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241, the very same that had fought bravely at Midway nearly 3 years before. By the time the war ended, no aircraft could match the Douglas SBD Dauntless. It sank more Japanese vessels than any other Allied warplane, destroying over 300,000 tons of enemy shipping, including at least 18 warships. And despite fighting through the most dangerous battles of the Pacific, the Dauntless had the lowest loss ratio of any U.S. Navy carrier aircraft, all at a modest price of just $29,000 per plane in 1944. From the waters off Midway to the skies over Norway and North Africa, the slow but deadly Dauntless became the most successful dive bomber of the war. Special thanks to Delete Me for sponsoring our video. Secure your digital privacy today by clicking the link in the description and using promo code DARKSKIES for 20% off. Stay safe, stay vigilant. Activate Delete Me now.